Okay, as you have heard, I will be speaking on what is happening to democracy in India. When we talk about what is happening to democracy in India, we will have to look at the democracy through three broad dimensions. Democracy therefore has three broad dimensions. One is to understand democracy in terms of its political process, in terms of institutions, and in terms of, should I wait? In terms of institutions and in terms of public policy. These are the three dimensions that democracy has. So any healthy democracy should have these three dimensions. When we talk of political process, we need to talk about voting, that there is mass participation in elections and there is free and fair elections in democracy. Then if you talk about the second dimension could be in terms of popular mobilization, that whether political parties are able to popularly mobilize people and citizens for their various programs. And third could be popular protest politics. People are able to mobilize themselves through protest movements, through NGOs, so on and so forth, in terms of influencing the democratic process. The second dimension of democracy, as I said, is institutions. Institutions are very important for a healthy functioning of democracy. And the institutions, when I say institutions, they mean various types of institutions. You have the legislature, you have judiciary, you have executive. And these institutions in a democracy need to function according to certain basic democratic principles, such as separation of powers. That is, power needs to be separated between judiciary, legislature and executive. Similarly, these institutions need to function around the principle of rule of law. That is, primarily institutions get their power from the fact that they are bound by constitution and constitutional norms. So only as long as institutions follow constitutional principles and constitutional norms, they are legitimate. If they are failing to follow constitutional norms, then these institutions become illegitimate. Therefore, one of the fundamental principles of institutions is that they should be bound by rule of law, that is law of the land. That is, therefore, law is a guiding factor for institutional functioning. These institutions, therefore, to follow rule of law, the other further dimension to institutions is procedures. That is, all institutions function around certain procedures, and these procedures have to be these procedures determine as to how institutions include people, how institutions are accountable, how institutions are transparent. Therefore, institutions, as I said, have to follow these norms, and this is an important dimension of democracy. The third dimension of democracy is public policy. That is, you have political process where you have popular protests, demands made by people. These come to institutions like legislature, for instance, where they are debated, discussed, where the demands are converted into certain legislative process. And the outcome of this is public policy. That is, these institutions finally end up in legislative. They make laws out of this process. And these laws are made, as I said, partly, mostly by legislature. That is a fundamental institution, basic institution that legislates and makes laws. You have judiciary, which plays a role, and you have other associated institutions like planning commission, which would get into 5-year plans. So there are various modalities through which public policy is made in democratic countries like India. So these are the three dimensions, and one can call a country has a healthy democracy only when we have all these three dimensions working in tandem, in consonance with each other. In other words, you should have right to protest, fundamental rights, civil and political liberties for the people, so that the political process is democratic and participatory and inclusive. This should impact the institutions. Institutions should be bound by the constitution and rule of law, so that in accordance they take the demands and responsive to the demands of the people, and this process should convert itself into law making process. That is, the laws of the land therefore should reflect the popular will of the people, the popular demands of the people, and should be as inclusive of the people as is possible. Therefore, now we come to the question that if this is the broad framework that I wish to adopt, then we have to raise the question as to how democratic is India and what is happening to democracy in India. Do we have a healthy and functioning democracy? This is a question that comes to us every day. And it's a question that is relevant in the minds of all the citizens. That is we keep raising this question, especially when we look at our neighboring countries like Pakistan or Nepal or Sri Lanka or Burma, where they are undergoing certain kind of a crisis in governance. Then the question that we often raise is that how good is democracy in India? I would try to raise about, I would argue that perhaps analyzing democracy in India in 2010 is a very challenging task, because democracy, there are certain patterns and trends, but I would argue that there is a bright side to democracy, but there are also equally worrying and dark corners to the democratic process in India. So both these sides have to be kept in mind, and I will take up certain representative cases for arguing why democracy is has a bright and a sunny side to itself, and I'll also point out to certain trends which will increasingly tell us what is worrying about democracy in India, and in the end we can briefly discuss as to what can be done to improve democratic standards and make accountable and transparent governance possible in India. Now, coming to the bright side of democracy, as I said, one of the important aspects of any democracy is inclusiveness. That is, democratic processes have to be inclusive. They should include people in terms of reaching out governance to as many people as possible, as many social groups as possible, because as you know, India is a very diverse country with a large amount of diversity in terms of ethnic group, nationalities, caste groups, class formations, regional differences, so on and so forth. So any responsive governance should reach out to all the diverse groups, and they should include them, and state resources of the nation, whether it is in terms of employment, job opportunities, income, ownership, so on and so forth, should reach to as many social groups as possible. Or if that is one of the important criteria for democracy in India, we can ask today the question that is democracy in India, is it moving towards more social equality, or is democracy increasing social inequalities? If social equality is one of the basic criteria for democracy, then I would pick, as I said, I'll point to 3 or 4 important bright side of democracy. What we can celebrate in Indian democracy today is the fact that there is a certain amount of inclusiveness that is happening. And one of the important modalities for inclusiveness that we have followed in Indian democracy has been policy of protective discrimination or affirmative action, or what in popular parlance referred to as the policy of reservations. As you know, when Constitution was made, Dr. Ambedkar, who was the founder of the Indian Constitution, had made an important and provision for affirmative action policies. That is, India perhaps is one country which has one of the most elaborate and detailed policy of affirmative action. That is, and when it was made in 1950s, it was the reservation was restricted to scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. But in 1990, beginning with 1990, the VP Singh government declared the operationalized the Mandal Commission recommendations, whereby the reservations was extended to other backward classes in India. And this recently in 2006, the UPA government has extended this reservation in higher education. So now we have reservation to the tune of 27%, and Supreme Court kept a cap of 50%. You should have all reservations included should amount only to 50% and should not cross that cap. So by that logic, 23% to SC/ST communities and 27% to OBC communities has been granted. And India has been following the policy of reservations for the OBCs since 1990 in central government jobs, and from 2006 onwards in the institutions of higher education. This, I think, is a very important progressive move in Indian democracy, where you are now including new social groups which have otherwise have not had opportunities to move up. So there are n number of young students from poor regions of India, from backward regions of India, where enough educational resources are not available, where income levels are low, people belonging to landless communities, so on and so forth, are now able to afford both higher education, and then they can also afford to, they can also dream of getting jobs in the central government. So this, I think, has been one of the radical proposals that has been made. It is also radical for another reason, that for the first time with the OBC reservation, we have recognized the criteria of creamy layer. That is, any family which has an income above 4.5 lakh per annum are not eligible for reservation under the OBC criteria. So it also not only is this reservation that operates around caste grounds, but it also operates around class grounds. That is, higher income economic groups within OBC communities are not eligible to get either employment or jobs or seats in central universities under this provision. Similarly, it has also been argued that this OBC should be extended not merely to Hindus, but we are now, the Mandal Commission has located, and a series of other commissions after that have located OBC caste groups within Muslims. That is, so we have now OBC communities and OBC reservation being extended to the minority communities as well. So we have class ground covered under this, we have religious minority ground covered under this, and therefore this makes it a holistic proposal to include new social groups, because we should remember that in India the OBC population is up to the tune of 50%. So 50% of our population has been located, has been identified as backward around social grounds, around cultural grounds, on educational grounds. So lot of state resources earlier which were not available to these social groups are now made possible through the OBC reservations. So this has been one important, to my mind, development in democracy today, that through popular mobilization it has been made possible to extend this. Similarly, the third angle that is important in OBC is that, as I said, the class angle, which is by cutting out the creamy layer, only the deserving candidate, we are ensuring that only the deserving candidates within the other backward classes get these reservations. So in states like Bihar, for instance, the Nitish Kumar government has identified MBCs, most backward classes, where people with through low income levels, through certain occupation traditionally tied down to certain occupations, the government has identified such social groups in India, and they are giving a subdivision. They have subdivided the reservations for within OBCs, and they are ensuring that OBC reservation reaches the most deserving. And this is how I think the bright side of Indian democracy has been, that it has become, over the last 10 years especially, very inclusive. Therefore, we have had reservations for the scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, and now we are having reservations for special provisions for other backward classes. We are also equally debating, now the parliament is still debating, that we should have 33% reservation in the parliament for women. So women is another social group which has been denied opportunities, because India has been a society where with traditional authority, and women have had very less opportunities. So through 33% reservation, we are assuming that there will be more representation in parliament, because through which we are assuming that there will be more social equality that women can attain in India. So that, I think, is one important side of Indian democracy today. The second important positive development in India has been that we have increasingly geared ourselves to address regional inequalities. India, as you know, is a large country, is a very diverse country, is also a very country which is rich in resources, mineral resources, coal, mines, so on and so forth. So in a country of this magnitude, it is bound that there are certain regions which have been left behind. There are certain regions which have developed. This has happened because of various historical reasons, which is very complex, which is very elaborate, which we will not be able to elaborate here. But suffice to say that in India we have had a very unequal development in the post-independence period. Therefore, there have been metropolitan cities. Development has concentrated on the metropolitan cities. It has concentrated on within certain states, and therefore various other reasons, certain regions within India have lost out. For instance, look at the regions in the northeastern region, or be it Kashmir, or certain pockets within developed states have lost out. And this regional inequality has led to a lot of unrest in Indian democracy. I think this is the second major impediment that we have been facing in India. There have been inequalities within region among social groups, but at the second level now, there are regional inequalities between states or regions within states. So inequality sort of percolated at that level. For that, Indian government, again, India has been proactive. Indian democratic process has been able to deliver, at least in last 10 to 15 years. After the first round of linguistic reorganization of states that happened in 1950s and 60s, India now, if you look at the formation of new and smaller states, it is happening not on the ground of language and culture, but is happening on issues of development. So those regions which we are finding have lagged behind in development through lack of industrialization, lack of employment opportunities, which have been regions which have attracted less investment, which has less infrastructure, so on and so forth. Those are the regions now which increasingly we are realizing perhaps needs independent and separate governance. Therefore, we have had in the recent past formation of states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Uttarakhand, so on and so forth. And now if you look at the popular democratic protest politics in India, one of the most popular demands that is going around in India is formation for smaller states, like issues like Telangana. Most of you must have heard in Andhra Pradesh is a very strong demand that has come up recently. Sri Krishna Commission, state government of central government of India has instituted Sri Krishna Commission, which has formulated and submitted its report, and which is also suggested that Telangana region within Andhra Pradesh has been left behind. That both in terms of GDP, in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of water resources, so on and so forth, this region got neglected vis-a-vis the coastal districts of Andhra Pradesh. And therefore, central government is now contemplating that how smaller states. So, for one of the big questions in Indian democracy that we are debating is that smaller states lead to better governance. Therefore, we are getting newer demands like Bundelkhand, we have Gorkha land, we have Vidarbha in Maharashtra. So there are many more demands. The popular perception mostly in India is that smaller states lead to division of India. Smaller states will create anarchy. Smaller states will divide India. The unity in India will reduce because of smaller states. This, to my mind, is not a correct perception. In a democracy, as in my introductory part, I said that the purpose of democracy and purpose of democratic governance is inclusiveness and social equality. If through having large states we are not able to deliver social equality, then simply having large states will not keep India united. Unity will come from two things: when people feel part of the process of governance and people have social justice, that is social equality. If through large states we are not able to deliver this, we should remember that its smaller states would make democracy more vibrant and will be able to deliver social justice better. As long as we are able to deliver social justice better, India will remain united and strong. If we fail on that front, however strong we might keep united the states, but democratic process will be continuously weakening. Therefore, Indian democracy is progressively been responding to this demand of regional inequalities, and that I think is the second healthy side of Indian democracy. Third aspect that I would like to mention here, that has been the most heartening part of Indian democracy, was the agenda of agriculture. That India is primarily still, with all its development of IT sector, with all its urbanization, with all its new metropolitan cities, with all the new malls that we see in urban areas, we are still a country that is agrarian in nature. That is 60% of our population still lives in rural areas, and this is a reality, and no central government, no state can afford to neglect. What had happened during the period of 1990s with the introduction of economic reforms in India was that we neglected agriculture. Suddenly the focus shifted to foreign direct investment, suddenly the focus shifted to corporate capital, suddenly the focus shifted to IT sector, so on and so forth. These sectors are important for the development of India. However, this cannot come at the cost of agriculture. I think some of the states in India made the mistake of neglecting agriculture. For about 10 years, I would argue that agriculture remained a very neglected area in India, which we could see, which got reflected in the spate of farmer suicides in India. But post 2004 elections, I would argue that agriculture is back on the agenda. And therefore, we have new policies. That is the old divide between what Sharad Joshi, an important sociologist, has referred to Bharat versus India. That there are two Indias in India. One is Bharat, which is a rural India. The other is India, which is an urban India. So, urban India should not benefit at the cost of rural India. That there have to be enough resources that have to be channeled towards rural areas, because as I say again, I am repeating, 60% of our population still lives in rural areas, and agriculture, we are an economy that is dependent on agriculture still. And therefore, we are now with the new government, with the new incumbent government coming in, we have agriculture is back on agenda in a very big way. And therefore, we have had to new subsidies programs, subsidies on fertilizers, subsidies on electricity. We are now debating to put in place the public distribution system back. The National Advisory Council that has been formed by the UPA government is now also demanding that we should have a new bill for food security. That is, all populations, both rural and in the urban poor, should have food security. That is, it is the responsibility of the central government to ensure that there are no population, no social groups which go hungry in India. We should know that there are the population that is still below poverty line is about 40% in India. So, which is staggering for any democracy. That is, we cannot legitimately be called a democracy if 40% of population in India still lives below poverty line, without basic food, without basic shelter, so on and so forth. So, the food security bill, which the National Advisory Council has been struggling for, if that gets passed, it will be a huge step in democracy to ensure basic food security to all people who live in India. Prior to this, the agricultural sector was also protected because of, in light of the spate of suicides, fluctuations in prices, so on and so forth. We had the MGNREG scheme, that is Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, under which the central government scheme under which 100 days employment was guaranteed to rural populations. Where minimum wages were given under this scheme, and which covers a large chunk of rural population. Therefore, by subsidies, by price protection, through NREG program, and now food security bill, I think agriculture and rural populations in India are protected in a big way in this democracy. And as I said, these new schemes will assure both inclusive participatoriness and social equality for agrarian sector. Now, I will move on to what I refer to as the dark corners of Indian democracy. So, these the three propositions that I made in terms of inclusive policies like reservations being extended, regional inequality is being addressed, and agrarian interest being addressed. I think these three have been the bright side of Indian democracy in the last 10 to 15 years. Now, I come to the dark corners of Indian democracy. That is, many of us living in urban areas, these are the dark corners which for some reason there is very little awareness. And we cannot analyze democracy or democratic process in India without taking the dark corners. And therefore, we need to put on table, we need to discuss, we need to demand from the governments that they need to address these dark corners that exist within Indian democracy. Otherwise, democracy will slowly erode, and we will increasingly move towards chaotic and violent sort of a situation, part of which we are witnessing in neighboring countries like Pakistan, or what is happening today in Egypt, that when people become restless, then democracies crumble. And no amount of physical force, no amount of army, no amount of police can ever protect any establishment, because what democracy ultimately means is a people's will. So, if that is our understanding of democratic process, then we need to raise this question, is India therefore a completely healthy democracy? What is the nature of problem in Indian democracy? What are the questions that are worrying for a democratic country of this kind? There I would point again, I have pointed to three bright sides of Indian democracy. Now I will point to the three what according to me are the darkest sides of Indian democracy. One very worrying trend that we are witnessing from the last 10 to 15 years is humongous rise in corruption. that you have seen various scams that have happened in the last 4 to 5 years, beginning with the CWG, the Adarsh Society scam, and the spectrum that we are discussing. It is within the nature of Indian democracy that we need to argue why scams of this nature happen. They happen partly, if you go back to my introduction that I gave, democracy has three sides: political process, institutions, and public policy. There is some problem with the way our institutions are working, that there is not enough accountability, there is no enough transparency, there are not enough laws perhaps which can restrict this kind of massive corruption and leakages that happen in government funds. Therefore, one of the worrying aspects that has happened is that over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a huge, massive rise in a kind of a new political class that has emerged, a middleman sort of a class, a mafia kind of a class that has emerged in Indian politics as a social base of the state. And this is a very worrying syndrome. You must have recently heard of the killing of the additional collector in Maharashtra, and they said that was a result of the actions of the kerosene mafia. Similarly, we have land mafia, you have liquor mafia, you have mining mafia, which are controlling governments across states in India. This, I think, is an increasingly worrying syndrome of the rise of new political classes which are cornering lot of resources, which are immune to institutional accountability, which are immune to law, and therefore we'll have to address as citizens of India that what do we do to these institutions, why political process, institutions, and public policy is not responsive to this growing political class, growing mafia that seems to be emerging within Indian democratic process. That is one question that all of you as young students need to debate. Second very important worrying syndrome that is emerging, that has existed in India for quite some time, is growing state violence. State has the monopoly in any democracy, in any sovereign state. One of the fundamental aspects of definitions of state is monopoly of use of physical violence. This is how Weber defines that one of the aspects of sovereignty is this. But this use of physical violence against its own citizens has to be done through rule of law. That is, you can only punish a citizen, or you can even take away the life of a citizen only on the basis of law. It has to be a law-bound process. It has to be accountable to constitutional norms. Any violence by the state in excess of this is unconstitutional and illegal. But as we are witnessing in the last 10 to 15 years or 20 or 25 years, there is an increasing amount of state violence in India which is unaccountable. It's unaccountable, arbitrary, and in complete violation of rule of law. Indian state is resorting to violence. This we are witnessing is happening across board. Chhattisgarh, central India, is a very strong example where you can see that tribals have been displaced by the corporate groups, and there has been a massive program demand now to rehabilitate this. There have been vigilante groups like the Salva Judum, which some claim are actually state-sponsored vigilante groups that have come in. If you look at Kashmir, that you have witnessed that in the last 6 months, about 200 young students lost their lives, and this was again due to excessive state violence. If you look at all the states of Northeast India, that whether it is Assam, Nagaland, Manipur, state is increasingly governing through special laws like the Armed Forces Special Powers Acts, which earlier versions was TADA, we had POTA, and increasingly state is becoming dependent on legislating special laws which are very draconian, which leave citizens with no fundamental rights. Even right to life is not left with the citizens under some of these laws. And this is a very unhealthy trend in any democracy. State would want us to believe that these laws are important because these are disturbed areas. These laws are important in the process of governance. These laws are important to maintain law and order, and state often gives us the argument that unless we don't maintain law and order, there cannot be development. But we need to understand that there is chaos because of lack of development, not because there was no order. Why Kashmir still there is such strong demands in Kashmir for either for secession or for self-determination is today has to be, we have to revisit this question, and that can only be settled through a political dialogue. Chhattisgarh, where tribals are being displaced because Indian state is arguing that there are mines and these mines are necessary for development. Access to these mines can be had, but that has to happen only in dialogues with tribals. We have had special laws in India where we argue that tribals live in protected areas, where the resources in tribal areas belong to the tribals and not to the nation. We have had special acts for this. Now the central government is arguing that we need to amend these acts so that these mines can be used. No doubt resources should be used for the development, but in dialogue with the populations that live in those areas, not by displacing and violating the fundamental rights of those populations. Similarly, northeast parts of India. Northeastern parts of India have remained summarily underdeveloped for last 60 years in post-independence. This is a question that the states and central governments have to answer. Why have certain regions in India have remained so underdeveloped? Why there are no enough job opportunities? Why educational opportunities are lacking in these areas? And central governments, state, instead of addressing this question, is increasingly moving towards addressing this question through violation of law. Similarly, the issue of minorities. There is a massive now violation of fundamental rights of minority groups in India. There have been n number of alleged and fake encounters that have happened in states of Gujarat, in Delhi, so on and so forth, and increasingly we are told that this is due to terrorism. Now there are two sides to this story. There could be certain groups, terrorist groups operating, but Indian state has to be extremely cautious in their governance modalities, that they cannot kill civilians, they cannot kill innocents, they cannot kill people unrelated to these incidents in the name of controlling terrorism. This has become increasingly the modality of governance. That is, you have to govern state through rule of law and not through exception from law. That increasingly state is moving towards exception from law, I think, is a worrying syndrome. And one of the important points, as I say, for any democracy is dialogue. That states in central governments have to initiate dialogue through various forms. It could be through peace talks, whether it is with the Maoists in Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand or West Bengal, whether it is with Alpha in Assam. The only resolution is that we'll have to understand that in India today we have large chunks of India, whether it is Kashmir, Northeast or central India, are under militant influence. And these militant groups, one should always understand that they have some sort of social base. They have a popular base and they emerge from socio-economic problems. If you don't understand that, and if you simply treat these movements as law and order problems, there is no doubt there is a law and order dimension to these movements, but these are not simply law and order problems. These movements emerge with a political. If you look at the Maoist movement in India, which has earlier was referred to as an Naxalite movement in India, if you look at what have been the demands of this movement has been demanding land reforms, this movement has been demanding implementation of minimum wages, and this movement has been demanding prohibition of liquor. These are all three provisions that are available in the Constitution of India. Why do you need a militant movement of this nature to be foregrounding demands of this nature in Indian democracy? That means there has been something terribly wrong with the governance of India, which has failed to implement a program of land reforms, which has failed to ensure implementation of minimum wages, and which has failed to prohibit sale of liquor. And this was one of the Gandhi's ideals, that the liquor should be prohibited in a country of India. But today states argue that we need revenue, therefore sale of liquor is absolutely essential. Therefore, the important point is that most of these movements are political in nature, and the demands that they have are political in nature. Of course, it is not allowed within a democracy to use violence as a legitimate means, but in the process of negotiating these movements, you need to use democratic means, you need to ensure peace talks, so on and so forth, so that democratic governance is ensured within the state. And that's how democracy would mean that in ensuring these sides. So I will now conclude. I think I have about another 5 to 10 minutes. I will now conclude by arguing that therefore we need to re-raise the question that we raised at the beginning of this show, that what is democracy, what is happening to democracy in India, how are we faring in terms of. I have enlisted both bright and the dark corners of democracy. These have complex interlinkages, so I do not really have the time to get into all of that, but I will conclude by arguing that, as I said, there are 3 dimensions to democracy. There is a dimension of political process, there is a dimension of institutions, and there is a dimension of public policy. If you look at democracy in India, as far as political process is concerned, that there have been a large number of popular protest politics, large number of mobilizational politics, there are large number of social movements of various kinds. There are environmental movements, there are movements of women, there are movements by Dalits, there are movements by tribals, there are movements against developmental projects like POSCO and others in Orissa, so on and so forth. So there have been a large number of political and social movements in India. Therefore, in a sense, I would argue this is a very strong point of Indian democracy, that there are a large number of protest politics, there is a large number of non-governmental organizations which are taking up issues of this kind and foregrounding these issues of massive social inequalities, massive economic inequalities, massive regional inequalities that exist in India. Therefore, on one hand you see large protest politics. The second side is institutions. That is, how much are these demands being taken up seriously by institutions in India, whether it is judiciary, whether it is legislature, or whether it is executive. This again, I think this is where we have to ensure that institutions have a difficult job of accommodating various demands, and institutions can only perform this role successfully, as I said, if they are bound by law, rule of law. Therefore, institutions have to be increasingly become norm bound. So as I said, we need to check corruption, we need to become, institutions need to become more accountable, more transparent, and more bound by rule of law. How do we ensure this? I think this has happened only through process of popular mobilization and through popular protest politics. And third dimension of democracy, as I said, is public policy. That is, increasingly law-making process in India should become responsive to political demands. That is, the purpose of governance is not use of violence. Purpose of governance is to make laws which are sensitive to social, political, and economic issues. Therefore, purpose of lawmaking should be increasingly to address social inequalities, economic inequalities, and give more opportunity for citizens to participate. But if we misuse that lawmaking process by violating laws, by violating principles of rule of law, and increasingly replace a political process through a coercive process by using police violence, using army, using paramilitary forces, then one should know that there is something wrong with a democracy of this nature. It is precisely for this reason that why today democracy has collapsed in Pakistan is because of excessive army intervention. That India has performed as a strong, as a healthy, as a free and fair democracy because we have had a civil governance, and we had both police and armed forces under the control of civil governance. And today we are finding a disturbing syndrome in India, that increasingly police and armed forces are becoming autonomous. Increasing number of areas in India are coming under the control of, direct control of police and armed forces, which are no longer under the control of civil forces. I think this is a very disturbing trend in democracy. We'll have to find ways of reducing the number of draconian laws that we are passing, whether we should immediately repeal Armed Forces Special Powers Act, we should immediately put an end to fake encounter killings, extrajudicial killings that are happening in India, and bring all of this process back into a democratic process. When I mean democratic process, that is, there is a consonance or continuity between political process, institutions, and public policy. Then one could argue that democracy in India would not only be safe, but also would be healthy democracy, which, as I said, would be possible only with by addressing issues of social justice. Thank you.